Most of us probably think the U.S. Constitution was born out of some quiet, philosophical debate. But the real story? It's way more dramatic. We're talking about a government that failed, a pretty violent rebellion, and a series of last-ditch compromises that almost ripped the brand new nation apart. All right, let's get into it. So, to really get how we ended up with the Constitution, you have to start with this question. Because America's first shot at a government, the Articles of Confederation, was intentionally designed to be weak. And that weakness, it set the stage for a massive crisis that would change, well, everything. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this first government. Now remember, they had just finished a war against a powerful king, so the founders were absolutely terrified of creating another strong central government. Their solution was to leave almost all the power with the states, which kicked off this huge debate about state versus federal power that, honestly, we're still having to date. Just think about how wild this is for a second. The central government could declare war, but it couldn't actually draft any soldiers to go fight it. It could borrow tons of money, but it had zero power to tax people to pay it back. What you ended up with was a government that had all these huge responsibilities, but practically speaking, no real power to do any of it. And this, as you can imagine, led to complete and total gridlock. I mean, try to get anything done when there's no president to enforce the laws and no national court to handle arguments between states. And the cherry on top? Any new law needed 9 of the 13 states to agree. The country was basically stuck in neutral. Now, this weakness wasn't just some theory on paper. Oh, no. It led to a real-world crisis that pushed the young country right to the edge. And this was the moment when a small group of angry farmers basically put a giant spotlight on the fatal flaws of the Articles of Confederation for the entire world to see. Put yourself in their shoes for a minute. You're a farmer. You just fought in the Revolutionary War for your freedom, but now you come home and you're about to lose your farm. See, the state of Massachusetts was buried in debt, so it started hitting people with heavy taxes. And for the farmers who couldn't pay, they were getting thrown in jail and having their land seized. Well, all that frustration just boiled over into what we now call Shays Rebellion. It started as protests, but it escalated fast. Led by a former army captain named Daniel Shays, these farmers literally stormed and shut down the very courthouses that were taking their land. At one point, they even tried to raid a federal arsenal to get weapons. And the national government? It was completely powerless to do anything about it. A state militia had to deal with what was really a national crisis. This rebellion sent absolute shockwaves across the country. The wealthy elite were terrified, but guys like Patrick Henry, they were suspicious. He famously said, "I smell a rat." They saw all this chaos as just a convenient excuse for men like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison to push for what they'd wanted all along, a much stronger, much more powerful central government. So here's the key takeaway. Even though the rebellion itself was crushed, in a way, it actually succeeded. It was the final straw. It proved to leaders like George Washington that the Articles of Confederation weren't just flawed, they were broken beyond repair. Something had to change, and it had to change fast. And all that momentum led everyone straight to Philadelphia. But, fixing the government wasn't going to be simple. The delegates showed up with some deep, deep divisions and totally different interests that threatened to blow the whole thing up before it even started. So, in the steamy summer of 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia. Rhode Island, by the way, just didn't show up. George Washington was in charge, and to make sure everyone could argue and debate freely, he made them all swear an oath of absolute secrecy. They literally nailed the windows shut in the summer heat so no one could eavesdrop. That's how high the stakes were. Right away, the whole convention split into 2 groups. You had the big states, like Virginia, pushing their Virginia plan. They wanted representation in Congress to be based on population, which, surprise, would give them all the power. But then you had the small states backing the New Jersey plan, demanding every single state get an equal say no matter its size. For weeks, they were just stuck, a total impasse. And the solution came from Roger Sherman of Connecticut. It became known as the Great Compromise. And it was brilliant. It created a legislature with 2 houses. In one, the House of Representatives, representation is based on population. That made the big states happy. In the other, the Senate, every state gets 2 senators, period. That protected the small states. This was the big breakthrough that saved the entire project from falling apart. But of course, there were other, much darker compromises made. To get the southern states to sign on, the delegates came up with the 3/5 compromise. This was a decision to count 3/5 of a state's enslaved population when determining representation. It gave the southern states more power in Congress, but it also tragically baked the institution of slavery right into the nation's founding document. So they finally had a draft written, but the fight was only half over. Now they had to go out and convince the American people to actually accept this radical, brand new form of government. And, well, that was not going to be easy. Right away, the whole country split into two factions. On one side, you had the Federalists, led by guys like Alexander Hamilton, who were making this passionate case for the new Constitution. And on the other side, you had the Anti-Federalists, people like Patrick Henry, who were afraid that this new government would become just as much of a monster as the one they'd just fought a war to get rid of. Really, their arguments came down to this one fundamental disagreement. The Federalists believed a strong government was absolutely essential for the country to survive. The Anti-Federalists feared that very same government would just crush the individual liberties they'd fought so hard for. And the biggest sticking point of all, a Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists insisted it was essential, while the Federalists at first just said, nope, totally necessary. So this debate just raged on in newspapers and state conventions. It looked like another stalemate. And to finally break the deadlock and win over some of the really skeptical states like Massachusetts and Virginia, the Federalists had to make one last massive concession. And this was the dealmaker, right here. The Federalists gave their word. If the states would just ratify the Constitution, the very first thing the new government would do is add a list of amendments protecting individual rights. That promise was just enough to tip the scales and get the votes they needed. And you have to understand, this Bill of Rights wasn't just some random list of nice ideas. Each and every amendment was a direct answer to a specific abuse the colonists had suffered under the British. The First Amendment, guaranteeing free speech, that's a direct response to a time when criticizing the king could get you thrown in jail. Remember that old British Quartering Act, the one that forced colonists to let soldiers live in their homes? Well, that's exactly why we have the Third Amendment. It was written specifically to make sure that could never, ever happen again. You can draw a straight line from the grievance to the right. And it's the exact same story for the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches. This wasn't some abstract principle. It was a direct reaction to British officials who would use general warrants to just barge into people's homes whenever they felt like it. Each right was like a shield, forged in the fire of a real colonial grievance. So, when you look at the big picture, from the absolute chaos of a farmer's rebellion, a new government was born, built on a series of really tough bargains. The Great Compromise still shapes our Congress, and that promise of a Bill of Rights still defines our freedoms. It really leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. Which of those foundational compromises, made over 200 years ago, do you still see shaping the debates and divisions in America today?